Before we start this video, a large thank you to Will, Vile, Vanessa, Gabriel, and this guy just has the less than sign for his name. Thank you for your support, guys. I hope you enjoy the video. Hello guys, alright, let's go open up our projectile spell scripts, and we're going to make some additions to it. So right now we have successfully cast spell. We're going to add an instantiated game object to this, so after we cast the spell, we instantiate the actual spell effect that will follow and attack our enemy. So first, let's actually call upon the camera manager. Actually, it's camera handler in this project, getting my projects mixed up. But we're basically going to need to know some things when we're instantiating this, like where the camera is facing relative to our player, etc., etc. So let's go ahead now and call that, and then we're going to have to go back to the base successfully cast spell on both the spell item and the healing spell scripts, and we're going to have to add in the camera handler, otherwise this won't work. So let's quickly do that. I'm just going to go over here now and just paste that here and save it, and then again on the projectile spell, we're actually going to need to put it right here as well. So we're actually going to need the weapon slot manager as well, because we actually need to know where to instantiate this game object. Let's just correct this error here by pasting this here and just saying camera handler over here. Next, we're going to say game object instantiated spell effects is equal to instantiate. Then we're going to instantiate our spell cast effects, and then we're going to want to put that on our player's hand. And for that, as you know before, as up above, we're actually going to need the weapon slot manager. So just as we copied the camera handler to our other classes, we're going to copy the weapon slot manager and put that in on our projectile spell, our spell item, and our healing spell on the successfully cast spell functions. And from there we can then initialize, or rather instantiate, this game object, the spell effect, in our player's hand. Now in this video we're just going to instantiate it in the right hand, but in the future we'll easily decide whether it will be the left or right hand, and we'll mirror the spell animations depending on your hand. That's super straightforward to do, and you guys probably know how to do that, but if you'd like me to do it in the follow-up video, just let me know. So then we're going to say weapon slot manager here, and let's go back to our projectile spell, and let's say instantiate spell effects, and then we're just going to say weapon slot manager dot right hand slot dot transform dot position. We're going to say comma camera handler dot pivot transform dot rotation. So basically it will instantiate it into our player's hand and rotate it wherever the camera is facing. Then we're going to say rigid body is equal to instantiated spell effects dot get component rigid body. And then we're going to say spell damage collider, which we don't have made yet. This will be a future script we add in another video when we do damage calculations for different kinds of spells. For now, we're just going to give it a flat damage. Then we're going to say equals instantiated spell effects dot get component spell damage collider. So in the future, we're going to actually allocate the spell's damage from this part of the script, and the damage will be a flat number times your player's current skills, etc., etc. But for now, we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus on spawning in the spell, giving a flat damage rate, making it hit something, explode, and do some damage. Then we're going to say rigid body dot add force. We're going to say instantiated spell effects dot transform dot forward times projectile velocity. So this will give it a velocity facing forward. And then we're going to say rigid body dot add force. We're going to say instantiated spell effects dot transform dot up times projectile upward velocity. And let's make that right now. And while we're at it, let's rename projectile velocity to projectile forward velocity. So then we'll have projectile upward velocity and projectile forward velocity. So the upward velocity is actually so if you want to give it some oomph coming out of your hand, because we're actually going to make another check for if the spell uses gravity. And if it uses gravity and has some mass, it's going to drop over time. So giving it that initial pop at the start will make it kind of pop up just a bit more. And that's how the fireball effect works in Dark Souls 3. So let's make another header here, or a couple, one for projectile physics, one for projectile damage. And then right below here, let's actually make a bool right here for is affected by gravity. So if it's not affected by gravity, it will just fly in a straight line until it hits something or it disappears. If it is affected by gravity, it will slowly make its way towards the ground depending on how heavy it is. So we'll say rigidbody.useGravity equals is affected by gravity. And then we'll say rigidbody.mass equals projectile mass, which we have not made yet. Let's make that right now. So right below here, public float, projectile mass. Okay. Looking good so far. Let's say instantiated spell effects.transform.parent is equal to null. And now when we instantiate into the world, it will unparent from your player's game object and will just be a free-floating game object in the scene. Let's double click here and check this error. Let's just add the camera handler and the weapon slot manager on this successfully cast spell. I think we need to call the camera handler because it's not a variable in the player attacker, which is fine. We can just go up here and make a variable of type camera handler, and we will call it on awake using the find object of type call. So there we go, camera handler, and we'll say camera handler equals find object of type camera handler. You can optionally just make it public and drag it in if you'd like. It's all the same, really. Okay, let's save that. Alright, next, let's go into the game here, and on our fireball spell, I'm going to make the base damage 75. I'm going to make the projectile forward velocity 500. I'm going to make the projectile upward velocity 150. I'll say the mass 25, and I'll check is affected by gravity. And now if we start up the game here, and I go to instantiate this, as you can see, I will actually throw a ball of fire that is affected by gravity, but when it hits something, it bounces off the ground, which is not what we want. We want to make sure it explodes and does some damage when it touches something. So if I uncheck is affected by gravity, as you can see, it flies up in the air undeterred and will keep rising forever and ever. Okay, let's go on the fireball projectile here. And let's add a spell damage collider script. Okay, let's go up here and we're going to say namespace. I'm going to say SG. And then I'm going to erase the start and update functionality. And let's actually start making some logic in this. So this is going to control what happens to our particle effect, its explosion, what it does when it hits something, etc., etc. So let's make a public game object called impact particles, which would be the particles that we see when the projectile hits something. We'll make one called projectile particles, and then we'll make one called muzzle particles, which is just the particles you'll see that will appear in your hand as you throw it. Kind of gives it like a pop. And the projectile particles will be the projectile itself soaring through the air. Okay, so let's make a bool for has collided. We'll initialize that at false. Then we'll say start. And what we're going to do here, set up a couple of things. First, we're going to say projectile particles equal instantiate projectile particles. And we're going to instantiate them this transform.position and this transform.rotation. Simple enough. Then we're going to say projectile particles.transform.parent equals transform. So it will be this, that is the parent. Then we're going to say if muzzle particles do exist, we'll instantiate those as well. So the muzzles are optional, but you need to have a projectile. And then we'll say muzzle particles equal instantiate muzzle particles transform dot position and transform dot rotation. And then we're going to say destroy muzzle particles after about 2 seconds. So that will get rid of it. And we're just going to say how long the muzzle particles last. Then below the start, let's say on collision enter. And this is going to run logic every time the collider on this game object collides with another collider. For long as this collider has a rigid body, I believe. We're going to say if we have not collided, has collided is equal to true. Then we're going to say impact particles equal instantiate impact particles transform dot position transform dot rotation. So when you hit something, we're just instantiating the impact of the explosion then. We're actually going to say transform dot position, then we're going to say quaternion dot from to rotation, vector 3 up, and I need to actually make a vector 3 here for a normal. Okay, yeah, so we'll just make one real quick. Just right below here, this is just for the rotation of the particles essentially. It's not used for much else. We'll say vector 3 impact normal. And I'm just going to make a comment here, used to rotate the impact particles. I spelled particles wrong, but I'm not going to correct it. And we're going to say impact particles, or impact normal rather, sorry. Okay, that looks good. Let's actually make the spell damage collider derive from a damage collider, so we get all of the effects of our damage collider as well. Our damage collider effects being, of course, the logic that runs when we enter another collider, and we have our current weapon damage, quote unquote, which we can rename. We're actually going to change the weapon or the damage collider's damage to that of the base spell damage in a future video when we do those calculations. But like I said, for now, going to leave it as the raw damage value that you assign it. You can just change the current weapon damage value to whatever you'd like. Also, make sure to drop in your impact particles, your projectile particles, and your muzzle particles. Okay, if you have any, that is. Next, we're going to say destroy projectile particles, because when we have the impact, we want to destroy the projectile itself. And then we're going to say destroy impact particles after, you can give it a time, like 1 second, 1.5 seconds. I think 5 seconds might be a bit too long because I have a light underline, but I can adjust it later, it's okay. And then you can destroy any other particle effects that you have. I'm just going to destroy the game object as well after an allotted time. We'll say, again, 5 seconds. That may be too long, but we can correct that. Alright, so let's duplicate this projectile here, and we're actually going to rename it first, rather, to object, and then we're going to duplicate it. And the reason being is because we actually don't want any rigid body or collider on the projectile. We only want it on the empty game object that spawns the projectile. So let's rename this to projectile. And then I'm going to remove the spell damage collider script, the rigid body, and the sphere collider. So basically what's happening now is, and then we're going to drag this projectile onto the projectile section of the object. We only want this object to house the rigid body and the sphere collider. The particles that it instantiates, we don't want it. Okay, so then we're going to go over here on the damage collider script, and we're going to make a bool called enabled on startup. And we're going to initialize that to false, because for weapons like swords and stuff, we don't want that initialized. And then we're going to change damage collider.enabled equals enabled on startup on the awake method. And now on the actual spell damage collider, we'll have an option to toggle that to true. That way when the spell becomes active, the damage collider is always active, without the necessity of an animation event turning it on or off. So again, this is just changing it to being active on awake. This will not affect slashing with swords or axes, because that will be turned on via animation events. Alright, so let's save that. Looks good. Let's toggle this right here. And you can also come in here and delete any of the particle effects if you wish on this game object, because again, we're instantiating the particle effects via the variables we gave it, like the projectile, muzzle, and impact effects. Alright, next, we gotta find a way to do some damage, so let's go up here and we're going to add a character stats. And then we're going to call that character stats variable our spell target. So this is going to be what our spell hits. And then down here on the on trigger enter, after we have collided, we're just going to say spell target is equal to, it will be other dot transform dot get component. It will be other dot transform dot get component character stats. And then we're going to say if spell target does not equal null, we're going to say spell target dot deal damage. And now we're going to go to the character stats, the original base class. We're going to make a public virtual void for take damage. Let's go over here on the player stats and see what's happening. Alright, so we're going to copy the int damage and all this information. We're going to paste it here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to the enemy stats and the player stats and make it an override void. That way when we call take damage from the character stats, it will affect both the player stats and enemy stats. And this stops us, this stops the need to make a separation for both player and enemy when we're doing those damage calculations. So then we can go to the enemy stats over here. Again, just say public override void. And since these both derive from character stats, the take damage function will pass on to two of these separate scripts depending on if it's a player or an enemy. Then we're going to say spell target dot take damage, and we'll pass the damage set to the damage collider, which I believe is called weapon damage perhaps. You can rename that if you want to just collider damage, since this will be the damage on spell colliders as well as weapon colliders. But for now, I'm just going to keep it as it is, because we're going to do some changes to the spell collider in a future video anyway. So let's just say current weapon damage. Okay, good. Don't mind the on-trigger enter. I had to do some tests, something wasn't working, but it gets fixed later in this video. Now, I have no idea why, but on the spell Damage Collider, if you say Rigid Body, and then make it Rigid Body, and you call it Unawake, the on-collision enter will work. For some reason, it wasn't working on this project if I didn't call the Rigid Body Unawake, but it was in another project. So if for some reason your on-collision enter isn't triggering, just make a Rigid Body variable and call it Unawake. And if you find your spell is colliding with your own player, just go into the game object here and actually just offset the actual transform of it just a little bit, so it's up and ahead of the hand. And then when you go into the game and you toss it, it works and it explodes on contact. Okay, cool. So we still have to make a couple more alterations and then we are done. So let's go down now to successfully cast spell, and right under the Rigid Body we're going to say if camera handler dot lock on target, or your current lock on target, is not null, then we're going to do some logic. So if you currently have a target and you are locked onto them, then we are going to do the following. We're going to say instantiated spell effects dot transform dot look at, and we're going to look at our camera handler dot current lock on target. So this basically just directs the spell's rotation right towards the person you're locked onto, which will make the projectile head for them. In a future video, we are going to add tracking over time, but right now this is just going to aim at them when you're initially locked on. So then we're going to say instantiated spell effects, if you're not locked on, dot transform dot rotation is equal to quaternion dot Euler, and we're going to say camera handler dot camera pivot transform dot x, comma, then we're going to say player stats the transform dot Euler angles dot y, and then we're going to say 0. So, we're actually going to need to say camera pivot transform dot Euler angles dot x, and all this does is makes it so basically you're going to judge the height of your projectile by the camera, but the direction of it based on where your player is looking. So check this out. If I look this way and look up, I'm going to angle the fireball up. If I look down, as you can see, I'm lobbing it more towards the ground, and now I'm throwing it right at the ground. This is how Souls does it too. So you're always going to throw the projectile wherever your player is facing, but the height of the projectile, the angle you throw it at, will be how much you're aiming up or down. So now if I go over and lock onto this guy once again, as you can see, we can just approach this guy now, and we actually can get his attention, and we'll dodge, and we will throw a fireball. That will do some damage. We'll throw a fireball again, and now he is dead. Alright guys, now you have a fully functioning projectile spell system that is affected by gravity. You got some upward and forward velocity variables you can play with, and it will impact, and on impact it will spawn an explosion, and you'll have some muzzle effects as you fire it. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like. It does help get the YouTube video around. Leave a comment to appease the YouTube algorithm gods. And if you're feeling super generous, check out my Patreon below. On the next spell video, which won't be for a little while, we're going to make it so certain spells will track your enemies and follow them. And we're actually going to make it so we can pass along spell damages, which we calculate from your stats, and a combination of that with the base spell damage itself to give you a total amount of damage. So I will see you in the next one.